Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the inaugural Anne Frank lecture. This is the first in what we plan as a series of lectures to be delivered by the key thinkers of our time. I'm going to be brief because you're certainly not here to listen to me, but to our wonderful lecturer, Simon Schama. But you will understand that I've got a few important thanks to make. Now, the idea for the Anne Frank lecture series came not from me or from any of the Anne Frank Trust colleagues, but actually from one of our longest-serving and most dedicated patrons, the distinguished political theorist, Professor Lord Bhikkhu Parekh. After a rather memorable cup of tea in the House of Lords tea room, Lord Parekh not only gave us this wonderful idea, but also the generous sponsorship for 3 annual lectures from his own family trust, the Neerman Foundation. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to thank Lord Parekh for his commitment to our charity over so many years. Our academic partner is the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. How fitting a partner in this, the week of our National Holocaust Memorial Day, and for a lecture in memory of Holocaust victim Anne Frank. Based at Birkbeck, University of London, the Pears Institute is a brand new centre, the only one of its kind in the UK that is dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of racial prejudice and intolerance. Launched just 3 months ago, it already has an impressive programme of research, teaching, and public events. And I would like to thank both Professor David Latchman, the Master of Birkbeck, for his fortuitous matchmaking between the Pears Institute and the Anne Frank Trust, and Professor David Feldman, Director of the Pears Institute. They have both given us wonderful help, cooperation, and support. And in his absence abroad, he's currently overseas, our joint benefactor, the remarkable Trevor Pears, newly made a Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. I'd also like to thank our media partners, the Times and the History Channel, for their fantastic coverage and promotion. And just please indulge me, the members of the Anne Frank Trust team who've worked so hard and so enthusiastically on this event. This event is actually the first of the year that marks the 20th anniversary of the Anne Frank Trust UK. And many of you in the audience have worked closely with us on our educational projects, young leadership programs, and our famous travelling exhibitions. And you have helped us over the 2 decades since our launch to become leaders in the moral education of Britain's young people, educating around 125,000 people each year and targeting some of the most socially deprived and divisive areas of the UK. For this, I thank you too. I could talk to you for the next 20 minutes about all of this and the transformative power of learning about Anne Frank that it can have on changing negative attitudes and behaviours. But do just please keep in touch with us about our forthcoming events through our website and newsletters, and take a look at the flyer we've given you. As well as our educational events, there is a wonderful 20th anniversary dinner happening in June at the Business Design Centre, and plenty of other opportunities to support our work in other ways. And now, our speaker. Wow. What a coup for the first Anne Frank lecture to get Simon Schama. Reflected in the fact that for each of you sitting here this evening, there is a long line of people who couldn't get in. Simon Schama has recently been appointed as history advisor to the government to help young people engage more with this hugely important subject. His list of academic achievements, his hugely popular books, and television and radio credits are just too long to list. But you all know why you wanted to be here to listen to him. And personally, I can't wait either. Professor Schama's 1-hour address, entitled The Idea of Toleration and Its Fate in Modernity, will be followed by a short vote of thanks by Professor Lord Parekh. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Schama.
Very good. 1 hour, horrible chilly feeling on the back of your necks. Those of you sitting at the back near the doors are feeling so lucky, that you've got an escape route. Thank you, Gillian. And thank you, Lord Perec, as well, for one of the pleasures, daunting honour, really, that the occasion of attempting to deliver the first inaugural Anne Frank lecture is to learn more about the amazingly splendid work of education that the Anne Frank Trust has done. So I want to preface my remarks by thanking Gillian and Lord Perec and everybody associated with the Trust. Having contact with the Anne Frank Trust is like being sort of run over by an immense bulldozer of benevolence, really, I describe it as. It's a good feeling, basically. When we conjure up the features of Anne Frank's face, what do we remember first? Well, surely the smile, precisely because it happens in the teeth of despair. Sometimes it's nothing more than elfin mischief, the knowing cheekiness that ignites every so often through her writing. At other times, it's the full-on girly grin, so wide, artless, and brilliant that the rest of her countenance seems to arrange itself around it. And as anyone who's ever written anything about Anne Frank has always noted, is lit by an avidity for the life that would be denied her in Belsen. For a long time, I think, the world read the diary as a kind of antidote, if not, and this is a hard thing to say, a placebo for horror. It was exactly the literary equivalent, the literary play of that smile, and the sense of Anne's optimism about the redemptive possibilities of humanity that made her book first palatable to a post-war world that, for the most part, beyond the traumatized Jewish community, did not want to hear all that much about mass incineration. I remember when I was growing up, some of you, probably as old as me in this audience, actually, that it was actually difficult, even if you were a kind of Jewish kid, really, in northwest London to boot, to actually find out much other than the sort of, self-consciously upset stories that parents would tell about disappeared relatives in Vienna. I remember very well coming on the first book at all you could sort of read about the Holocaust in the synagogue library in Dunstan Road, Golders Green. It was Lord Russell's Scourge of the Swastika, and it was simply devastating to do that. No, Anne Frank was the only other thing, and they were at two poles, really, obviously a sensibility dealing with it. And the world, I also remember going through school, and we had wonderful history teachers in the First World War. Even then, there was Hitler. There were very seldom did we do the Henrys, actually. We had Hitler and no Henrys, actually, oddly enough. We had Hitler, but it was weird. It was the sort of sense, obviously, with Shirer's book and then with Trevor Roper's book and Alan Bullock's book coming, that the Jews were, the Holocaust was part of this, but it wasn't remotely, there was no sense in some way that the Third Reich had actually turned on the project of extermination that, made Hitler who he was. So I would still argue that a lot of the world wasn't ready, not at the time when Otto Frank initially tried to get the book published, for much talk of genocide. Sometimes this was true even within the bastions of Jewish Anglophone culture. It was, after all, Secker and Warburg, for God's sake, who in Britain declined to publish the diary, and in New York, another Jewish publisher, Alfred Knopf, explained to Otto Frank that, quote, the English reading public would avert their eyes from so painful a story that would bring back to them all the evil events that occurred during the war. When the diary did see the light of day, along with Meyer Levin's stage and film dramatization, it was usually with the sweetener that harvest of mass murder could still yield a fruit of self-affirmation. This consolatory obligation, I think, was a bit like the poster I saw early in the 90s at Krakow railway station. It really did say in English, day trips to Auschwitz, back in your hotel in time for tea. And you have to have the gallows humour of this audience in order to get that, I think. It was the degree to which the adolescent girl up there in the Achterhurst and the Prinsengracht was like us, rather than somebody necessarily just destined to end up as the brutalized scarecrow of Belsen, that made a mass readership possible. The declaration on July the 15th, 1944, the unquenchable optimist, the most famous mantra used in all the publicity for the film, the play, and so on. I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart, was, it seems to me, the necessary condition for the absorption of tragedy at that time. Since the diary stopped in August, early August the 2nd, 1944, what lay ahead for the girl could remain diffuse, even obscure, rather than the swallowing up of Anne Frank, belied by the survival of her words. Anne is not going to her death, wrote the Herald Tribune critic Walter Carr after seeing Levin's drama in 1955. This urge for consolation was, I guess, understandable in the circumstances. In the frightening climate of the Cold War, the Korean War, and the bomb, which would you rather have in your mind's eye if forced to contemplate the unfortunate matter of genocide, the trash mountains of naked skeletal cadavers, or Anne Frank's smile? The critical edition famously restored the physical and emotional immediacy of the budding teenager to Anne's text, a proper recovery which added the rest of her body to the smile. But what's much more shocking, in the last months of the diary, not so much her dawning sexual understanding, I think, so much as her sharpening historical understanding. The two kinds of sensibility, in fact, intimate and personal on the one hand, and political and impersonal on the other, are at war with each other. In the pages from the late spring and summer 1944, I'm split in two, she writes, the very day before the police and the SS arrive. Anne's precociousness is born from a rage that's only partly hormonal adolescent truculence. It's desperate rather than merely impatient, often unforgiving in its truth-telling, weighty in its prematurely grave wisdom. That mantra about people being good at heart is actually, as I'm sure a lot of you know, sandwiched between remarks about ideals being crushed by grim reality, when, quote, the worst side of human nature predominates. The subsequent anguish cry that it's impossible for me to build a life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. And she didn't mean it's impossible, therefore I'm going to be cheerful and chipper. She literally meant that it seemed to her at that point impossible. A world slowly transformed, as she wrote, shockingly and upsettingly and accurately, a world transformed into a wilderness. The Anne who, even as she allows herself excitement at the news of the Normandy invasion, the July bomb plot against Hitler, knows that neither is likely to save her and her family. The Anne who could write with chilling certainty, we are doomed. There is the suspicion staining the pages of spring 1944 that the norm for human behavior might, after all, be animal and predatory. There is in people, she writes, simply an urge to destroy, an urge to kill, to murder and rage, rather than ennoblement through fellow feeling, despite the countervailing knowledge that without such fellow feeling, she and her family and the rest of the inhabitants of the Achterhuis would already have been on their way to Westerbork and points east. Put another way, the bitter lesson that Anne had to digest as her intellectual coming of age was the defeat of the Enlightenment by the savagery it had thought to conquer. And this is from a girl, as you know, who's absolutely saturated in history reading, sometimes more homework, more than she wants to do. And it was made specially painful because that chastening for her, I think, had happened in a city and that in its own mythology had been the place where Toleration, Voltaire's beau ideal of reason, had first arisen, and where the foundation texts of Locke, Pierre Bayle, and Voltaire had, of course, first been published and disseminated through the Republic of Letters. So to be trapped and hunted in Amsterdam was particularly bitter, since it seemed to violate everything that Anne, the well-read historian, understood about the social and cultural history of her own city. But the plight of the Franks seemed to make glaringly clear just how tenuous that sustaining pluralism in fact was. And of course, Amsterdam right now, is once again a crucible in which the possibilities and impossibilities of pluralism, a genuine and porous cohabitation, are being brutally tested yet again in the conflicts between Muslim immigrants and xenophobic politicians like Pim Fortuyn. So while there's nothing wrong with, through the smile, universalizing Anne's experience of adolescence, that universalization does seem to me a little take the risk of leaching out the significance of exactly where Anne was and where she had come from. A German Jewish middle-class family, steeped in the Enlightenment obligations of Bildung, but eventual inheritors of the failure of Moses Mendelssohn's liberal vision of an unproblematic German Jewish identity. It mattered that in Anne's mind, the tolerant Netherlands was the answer to the ultimately intolerant Germany, and the faint possibility that even in her adopted home, the quest for an unproblematic acceptance of the Jews might be less secure than the Franks had imagined, eventually came in the spring of 44 to torment her. So when she asks in April of that year, who has inflicted this on us? Who has set us apart from all the rest? Who has put us through all this suffering? The force of the question is precisely because the confinement in the Achterhuis was at the same time at odds with the Jewish experience in the Netherlands, but at the same time only made possible the hiding place by the inheritance of goodwill, the sense of who has set us apart. She doesn't want to believe it can be her neighbours, Amsterdammers. Anne was surrounded by living and remembered evidence of the goodwill of Amsterdammers, above all, of course, Miep Gies and her husband, Otto Frank's personal assistant and employee. And Anne knew full well that the measure of that disinterested goodness was that Miep was, like herself, an emigrant from German-speaking world, a native Austrian of all people, born Hermina Santruschitz, who had taken a Dutch name and a Dutch identity. And Anne, of course, would not have forgotten the strike of February 1941, also, which took place in Zaandam and Haarlem, as well as Amsterdam, against the maltreatment and deportation of Jews and the sealing off of the Jodenhoek, the Jewish district, by the Marechaussee and units of the Dutch fascist NSB in collaboration with the Germans. She wouldn't have, of course, it'll be very close to her, the immediate memory of the reprisal executions, the mass shootings, and on the good side, the famous poster published at the time, "Stop the Abominable Persecution of the Jews," that suddenly appeared all through the Jodenhoek and through the city and become a legend, the poster itself. All of that would have reinforced in Anne's mind the commonplace that the Netherlands and her city in particular was the last citadel of decency and solidarity in an indifferent or hostile world. If she was spared to see the end of the war, she wrote, "My first wish would be to become a Dutch citizen. I love the Dutch, I love the country, I love the language, I want to work here." But Anne also she knew about the Dutch who did not conform to the ideal. Only 5,000 of the 80,000 Jews living in Amsterdam before the war survived. Their extermination could not have been accomplished without some collaboration from the native population. The actions of February 1941, of course, have been directed, the strikes, against Dutch fascists, the NSB, as well as the Germans. And as conditions in Amsterdam became more difficult and the rhythm of deportations to Westerbork ramped up in 43 and 44, Anne became commensurately distressed at stories from the outside that too many of the Dutch were compromising the resistance or even betraying it and Jews to save their own skins, that a Dutch antisemitism was actually alive and well. May the 22nd, she writes, 44. "I've only one hope, that this anti-Semitism is a passing thing. The Dutch will show their true colours. They will never waver from what they know in their hearts to be just, for this is unjust." But that same diary entry ends with a vision this might not turn out to be the case, that the legend of Dutch toleration would prove just that she, and it's incredibly moving, perhaps the most moving thing, certainly in that year, that she and her family were part of a handful, as she puts it, of Dutch Jews to survive, then we will have to go. This is after the war. We too will have to shoulder our bundles, move on, away from the beautiful country which once so kindly took us in and now turns its back on us. It's really heartbreaking. The acute poignancy of Anne's late vision, the discoloration of the toleration idyll of the Netherlands, didn't imply, I think, its complete abandonment, just Anne's informed and maturing sense that even in her homeland, the idea, much less the practice of toleration, was always up against steep odds. So if Anne was with us today, if only, she would have been, what, Gillian, 82? I was trying to figure it out, 82? 81, okay. Yeah, I think she wouldn't have been surprised to find that those odds are no less daunting today than they were at the time of her own crisis. Because surprising as it might be to people of my generation, brought up to assume modernity would be defined by the Enlightenment vindicated. My history teacher, one of my history teachers, a wonderful man, when we were about sort of 13 or something, he seemed to be the voice of Enlightenment, not least because he looked just like Houdon's bust of Voltaire, who's called Bob Irvin Smith. And he said, well, boys, we've no idea what the rest of the 20th century has in store for us, but this we know for sure, the nationalism and organized religion are totally dead, So much for the predictive power of history teachers. So we all thought that, yes, there was totalitarianism of both the fascist and communist varieties, but they were just postponements of the inevitable victory. And what I think has turned out to be a shock is the persistence of intolerance, whether something as atavistically tribal as the Rwanda massacres or religious intolerance, the Iranian regime's prescription of secularism, the Taliban's war on educated women. And these things turn out not to be marginal, not footnotes to our more comfortable version of modernity, but actually central to the peace of the world. Arguably, in fact, other than the slow death of the planet itself, the toleration wars, you might say, are the most dangerous threat to our collective, certainly cultural survival. So I want to use the balance of my time. Try a little bit of water. Yeah. To talk really about this odd misfortune, the hard slog that tolerance has had, actually, of the idea of toleration and its practice, the difficulty it's had rooting itself in the conditions of modernity with anything more than a fragile purchase. In the debates in the French Revolutionary National Assembly in 1789, over the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the Huguenot pastor Paul Rabot-Saint-Etienne insisted that there would come a time, very soon, the morrow, really, of their declaration, when opinion would not be a crime. Intolerance, he said, would survive merely as one of those barbaric words which no one has any longer has any reason to use. But even tolerance, the word tolerance, said Rabot, would be replaced because of its implication that there was something to tolerate simply by the word liberty, and that was the sturdy expectation of Condorcet, of Montesquieu, again, of course, to say nothing of the sardonic, and occasionally, his optimism famously shadowed by sardonic realism, Voltaire, who, after publishing his own treatise on tolerance in 1763, declared himself convinced that everyday reason penetrates more fully through France. That march of reason would, in fact, produce an edict of toleration, making Protestantism at least lawful in France a year before the Estates General was summoned in 1788. To the philosophe, then, it was just a matter of time before the decriminalization of belief conquered the world. That victory, the destruction of the superstition police, would constitute, in their view, popular modernity. But modernity, as we know, had some jokers up its sleeve, not least totalitarian speech and thought control. But the ultimate poke in the eye to Voltaire's sunny confidence has been the relatively recent resurrection of theocratic fundamentalism, with its self-declared war on the possibility of a secular life, not just the case in Iran or in the Taliban, Afghanistan. And though I'm not suggesting the state there has anything like the coercive power available to the guardians in Iran, in Israel too, there is a kind of cultural war going on now. Some of us wish it weren't the case. Concerted Orthodox campaign to make definitions of citizenship essentially subordinate to religious dogma. And what we're learning every day in all kinds of fields of conflict is that this issue is not, as I said, just a footnote, but somehow to modernity, but lodged within it. First, though, I want to talk about the good news from history, much as Anne Frank would have wanted to report it, I think. In the Dutch Republic and a few other sanctuaries in the Old World and New, although this idea is now much under scholarly revision and qualification, but I'd still myself find more unrevised in some ways than a revisionist. Toleration seems to me in the Dutch Republic not to have been a complete myth, but a lived reality, albeit a qualified and complicated reality. Let's take one famous instance, much remembered and celebrated in the Amsterdam community of Jews in the 17th century, as an exemplary act of neighborly solidarity, even though there are aspects of it which, as Peter van Roden has written about it, suggest might make it suspiciously more legend than altogether factual. Anyway, the story, preserved in 5 separate manuscripts, in different Jewish community manuscripts and even in one non-Jewish manuscript, concerns a member of one of the most prominent Sephardi families in Amsterdam, David Curiel, who was apparently waylaid by a German robber on the Gracht, on the canal streets, but was able to fight back against his assailant with the help of a hue and cry sounded by his Gentile neighbors. In the story, as I say, handed down by the community and actually added to the Megillah Esther, to the book of Esther, to be read at Purim, on the Feast of Purim, the high mightinesses of the states of Holland wrote Curiel a letter of regret and invited him, Dutch are always scientific in these respects, by way of judicial reparation to the formal dissection of the convicted robber in the Leiden University Anatomy Theatre. Certainly, whatever the status of the details of the event, it's surviving as a kind of locus classicus of the relationship in the Jewish mind of the relationship between them and their Gentile neighbors is certainly evidence of how the Amsterdam Jews viewed their own position in the city. The name of the intended victim is also very significant for the place of the story of toleration, toleration's cultural history. Curiel was a name that a number of family members, originally from Portugal, Coimbra in fact, took on reverting to Judaism in Holland and Venice, and Hamburg actually as well. David had originally been known as Lopo da Fonseca Ramirez, and his grandfather had been the Coimbra merchant Duarte Núñez, whose progeny constitute, as Miriam Bodiam and others who've written wonderfully about the Portuguese community, a chronicle of crossing the lines between persecution and toleration. Duarte Núñez's wife was arrested, his grandfather was arrested for Judaizing among the so-called New Christians, the Marranos, and he himself was denounced but died before he could suffer the consequences. Their children, including David Curiel's father, Geronimo Núñez Ramirez, were reverters. One of them died in Safat, another perished at the hands of the Inquisition court, still in Iberia. Geronimo's wife, in other words, David Curiel, the Amsterdammer's mother, Maria, had a half-sister who was burnt at the stake, cousins who had suffered torture, in one case fatally so. Under threat, Maria, the mother herself, fled from Portugal to Saint-Jean-de-Luz, from where her body was transported to be buried in Amsterdam by David under the name she'd wanted written on her tomb, Sarah Curiel. Despite all this, the Curiels very much held to their identity as Portuguese Jews, and many of them indeed acted as commercial agents for the same crown that persecuted them, that endorsed the Inquisition. This was not unusual. But in a way, this was fitting because they would have been under no illusion that the reception of their own community, the Sephardim in Holland, was entirely a matter of principle. The commercial advantage to be gained from Amsterdam having access to markets and connections in Spain and Portugal, as well as in the American Indies, was, of course, immense, very important to the Dutch. The bilingual, bicultural Jews, as Jonathan Israel and others have made clear, were at the heart of a network of connections that went from the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the Ottoman Empire, to the North African Maghreb, and right across the Atlantic to Brazil and the Caribbean. Dynasties like the Curiels brought silks and coral and gems to Amsterdam for processing and re-export, as well as those demons of addiction, sugar and tobacco. So, yes, sure, there was a strong element of economic pragmatism in the tolerance of the Dutch, and it But that didn't, of course, precisely because it was economic pragmatism, the Dutch were not immune from setting out very carefully exactly how tolerant they were going to be to the Jews. If anything, the wealth and success, the speedy wealth and success of the ex-Marano immigrants only increased the wariness of their hosts. So Jews, of course, were barred from the guilds. That was very important. So it meant you were not in textiles, you were not any of the great major sort of capital heavy. You couldn't import timber, you couldn't import copper. There were all sorts of things you couldn't do if you were not going to be part of the guilds. You were forbidden to intermarry with Christians. You were, of course, forbidden to Judaize. In fact, actually, you were forbidden to have sex even with Gentile prostitutes, in fact. This is a ban that the Jewish Orthodox were more than happy, of course, to observe. So it is said. But it'd be a mistake to assume the creation of a sanctuary was not also, on the side of the Dutch, the result of some principles, however nuanced. One of the reasons that the government of the Republic, the States General, the legislative government in The Hague, broke off peace talks with Spain in 1632, in the middle of the endless 80 Years' War, was precisely over the Spanish refusal to allow Jewish commercial agents, like the Curiels, to receive the same treatment as other non-Jewish Dutchmen in legal and commercial dealings. And, of course, that stand that the Estates General took was duly noticed by the Amsterdam community and the Jews living in The Hague and Rotterdam. It could be that decision, too, was taken for economic reasons, because those crucial commercial consuls and agents and connections, importers and exporters and providers of capital, could hardly function if they thought they were going to be nabbed by Portuguese and Spanish authorities at any moment. And also to have their crypto-Jewish Marano family connections pounced on in whichever Iberian city. But it could equally have been genuinely what it seems to be on the face of it, this extraordinary withdrawal from a favourable truce talk on the grounds that you're not treating the Jews equally. There was an element of principle in it, I think. It's true, though, the difficulty of disentangling principles and interests in Dutch toleration extended in the way they thought about Catholics and Mennonites and radical Protestants, too. But it was not unimportant. We should, again, as you all know, that there would have been no Dutch Republic had there not been a resistance prosecuted over this long period to militant Catholic absolutism. In other words, to a culture and a country and a monarchy and a church absolutely committed to, as it were, fundamentalist Catholic coercion. Inside Holland, inside the Dutch Republic, I should say, more largely, the same period when you were fighting off the Spanish and their centralizing control was marked by, without making you do a complicated exam right here, and it's late, on intra-Dutch politics. You really will all be fleeing for the exits if I do that. But I'll just make it very sort of noddy and biggies and simple. Essentially, the conflict inside the Netherlands was between hardliner Calvinists who wanted Roman Catholicism replaced by an equally hardline state Calvinism. And the other, their opponents who leaned towards toleration because they were much more interested in the sovereignty of local institutions. And they, of course, as it were, the more relaxed tolerationists thought of themselves, and said so, as the heirs of Erasmus and Erasmus's embrace of a more pluralist Christianity, one in which a single road to salvation, arbitrated by a priesthood, coercively enforced, whether by Catholics or Calvinist preachers and Calvinist courts, all that was rejected in favor, in this tolerationist view, of a pluralist congregation of Protestant confessions, each of which had to be persuaded to the right road. That's the sort of verbs you find in their literature. Left to find their own way, provided that the way they turned out to follow did not disturb the civil peace. Now, a lot hangs on this notion that the way you think about religion and authority and the way government is connected with it turns on this issue of what the humanists at that time called concordia, civil peace. Concordia was the official motto, actually, of the Dutch Republic. Yes, it referred to the concord between the 7 provinces who'd resisted the King of Spain, but it meant something especially for these neo-Erasmian humanists deeper as well. You could say that the connection between peace and a multiplicity of belief was the originating paradigm of toleration in embattled Christian Europe. But also, if you think about it, I think it's remained the case right through the arguments for toleration in the Enlightenment, and all the way to our own present conundrums and quandaries. For militants of any faith, whichever, any monotheistic faith certainly, who insist on a monopoly of salvation prescribed through a text, the authority of which is grounded on unarguable revelation, their organizing paradigm is necessarily combative, is it not? The obligation to impose godly conformity. All that remains is whether or not the campaign is a matter of physically violent coercion or is said to be merely militant exhortation. That, as I understand it, is at the root of the debate, intra-Muslim debate about what exactly the word jihad means. Conversely, on the other side, from the 16th century on, those who'd had enough of relentless bloodshed argued that peace, civil peace, concordia, was conditional on the acceptance of multiple confessional cohabitation, never in the sense of yielding ground on your own on your own choice of contending doctrine, but crucially conceding that difference did not carry with it the obligation of mutual extermination. That was what William of Orange, the first stadtholder and leader of the Dutch revolt, was committed to. It's what the most articulate of Dutch humanist writers like Dirk Volkertzoon Coenhert laid out, in his case in 1582, as the foundation of the peace of the concord-based federated state of the Dutch Republic. For those who agreed with Coenhert, Hollandse vrijheid, Dutch liberty, was interchangeable with and inextricable from freedom of conscience. This is a huge breakthrough. And at the outer edge of that cautiously tolerationist ethic, that went for the Jews too, up to a point. Now, the tolerationists in the Dutch Republic, as you know, seldom had it their own way, even in their aim for a more peaceable cohabitation between Christian sects. Suspicious or at least watchful hospitality might be the best way to describe the mentality which made it possible for the Jews to come to the United Provinces and certainly at least live free from the fear of the Inquisition. For the first decade of the 17th century, Jews still had to lead an undercover life in Amsterdam, actually. Only in 1616, when the States of Holland said that every city can make its own arrangement for the Jews, did breathing space actually open up. You could then finally, although it had been done provisionally and not really legally, property for burial grounds and synagogues had been acquired in 1609, but it was not legal until properly officially 7 years later. Even then, toleration shouldn't be confused with integration. Something like the opposite prevailed. The condition of Jewish toleration in Holland was autonomy, or if you like, separation. Jews, as I've said, had these bars on any kind of intermarriage, and they weren't supposed to have Gentile servants, though almost all of them did, but they were very, very strictly, of course, actually watched, lest any Judaizing take place. And as I say, they couldn't even remotely. There was worry about if they were allowed to print Dutch translations of Hebrew texts, whether that would be a kind of surreptitious conversionary effort. Also, rather shockingly, the same 1616 ordinance which made Jewish Amsterdam come out into the open, made it possible for magistrates in other towns in Holland to enclose the Jews in their own residential quarter. It never happened, but at least legally, in theory, a Dutch ghetto, just like the one in Venice, was possible. But it is significant that this never happened in any Dutch town that I certainly know of. Another thing that would have meant a lot to people like David and Sarah and Jacob Curiel and their family, a huge breakthrough from both Muslim and Christian confining worlds. That same 1616 ordinance that creepily made a possibility of a Jewish ghetto in Holland possible did, however, say one thing you cannot do is actually forced Jews to wear identifying dress. Still in the Muslim world, even in the more relaxed parts of it, there were edicts and ordinances which define your dhimmi subordinate status in all sorts of ways. You couldn't ride a horse, you had to ride a donkey, but above all in marks of dress. At a time, of course, when in places like Venice and Rome you had to wear pointed hats and yellow garb and so on. The only moment, in fact, in Dutch history when Jews were obliged to wear identifying marks was indeed in 1941. And then, before the executions and punitive arrests, another lovely story, which is true, so many Gentiles living in and around the Jodenhoek sewed, this thing that we all know happened in Copenhagen, happened in Amsterdam too, sewed yellow stars onto their jackets that the area became known, because of all the stars, as the Milky Way. This is a Dutch joke. Whatever it was then, that Amsterdam Jews had in this period of, what should we call it, passive toleration rather than civic acceptance, it was certainly not any kind of unproblematic integration. It was valuable, it was precious, it was a moment when toleration started. And of course, the latitude given to their very autonomy, their separation, enabled Jewish authorities. This is, of course, the other side of the story, like the Muhammad, the legal authority of the Sephardim, to be intolerant themselves, famously in the case, of course, of excommunicating the heretic Spinoza in 1656, who was forbidden in extraordinary terms of his cherem, which were much more violent than other kind of excommunications, actually. The most extraordinary thing was no one was allowed to come within 4 cubits of anyone good on qubit conversion tables, actually, of Spinoza, on pain of their own excommunication. So, although it's now, as I say, a scholarly commonplace to stress the degree to which the position of the Jews was not normalized in Amsterdam's civic life, nevertheless, there was some degree of civic neighborliness. Neighborliness was really what Anne Frank cherished most, for obvious reasons. And it did happen. Rembrandt famously lived in densely populated Jewish quarters, less famously, not just once, not just in the St. Anthony's Breestraat, known as the Joden Breestraat, but also the house before that was actually in the Zerkerkwartier, in little street grid of Vloenberg, where the Jewish sugar bakers and sugar processors all lived. It was overwhelmingly Jewish, one of the eastern islands of the cities. And there's a lot of Jewish sentimentality about Rembrandt painting Jews based on a misleading notion that only Jews had beards and wore skull caps. Every second Calvinist preacher had a beard and wore a skull cap, actually, in Amsterdam, which doesn't mean to say there were no Jews among some of Rembrandt's paintings. But we do know for sure, a very hard piece of evidence, that Rembrandt had more than a nodding acquaintance, of course, with Manasseh ben Israel, because he engraves extraordinary images, etchings for Manasseh ben Israel's Kabbalistic treatise Piedra Gloriosa. So there is some real fruitful cultural interchange going on. More significant, just as significant was the scale and ambition and grandeur of both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi synagogues built in the 1670s. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen them. There is nowhere else that I'm aware of. Bevis Marx is later. The Bevis Marx we know is sort of early 18th century. It's also carefully tucked away. These are immensely grandiloquent architectural statements that presuppose an amazing degree of confidence, and also they're on the itinerary of every guidebook, printed guidebook. This is the period when there starts to be guidebooks to Amsterdam from the 1660s onwards, and Tobias Domselaar and books like that. The synagogues play a part. All the tourists from England and France and Italy are urged to go there. This is, again, an extraordinary indirect piece of evidence. Bernard Picard's engravings of the rituals and celebration of Dutch Jews, from weddings to circumcisions, fasts, and feasts, again, is a first in European history. Says something really about the sort of the degree to which, without official legal integration, some genuine cultural symbiosis of the kind that Anne would have known about came to be possible. So the opening of a space for urban neighborliness, and there's time, must be lots of, eager Beaver graduate students in social history out there. Yeah? scrap whatever dissertation you're working on and do something on the idea of neighborliness in early modern European history. Fame and fortune will come your way, I promise. So given that is, I think, sort of how both the pros and the cons, the complications, what was possible, what was difficult, isn't a bad index to judge the distance that toleration had come in European culture, but also the qualifications are also not a bad index of the difficulties with which genuine integrative toleration, something that went from passive to active toleration, would have in the years that follows. So to review where we've got to in this story class, and you're thinking how long is it going to go on? The answer, 9 more pages. Should we all go off and have a drink and then come back? Hang on. Let's just take a check here. So the Protestant Reformation, breaking the monopoly of a Roman Church as the exclusive custodian of salvation, was the necessary but insufficient condition. Necessary but insufficient for the rise of toleration. Insufficient because, you only have to read Luther, for God's sake, a Protestant absolutism was quite as capable of calling for the annihilation of the Roman Antichrist as vice versa Inquisition and heretics. The situation is akin to the uneasy coexistence, or worse, say, of, and I'm happy to be corrected by Muslim friends here, of Sunni and Shia traditions in Islam, neither of which give way in their respective histories of the legacy and descent of the prophet and remain, whether actually at war or not, unconvinced that anything but the eventual capitulation of the deluded can bring about an eventual concordia or caliphate. The opposite, then, to recapitulate, was true for very small part of Christian Europe, in which an argument for Concordia presupposed the protection, if necessary by government and law, and we now are going a bit further forward, of pluralism, not the enforcement of conformity. Chances of Concordia, if you're going to be an enforcer, bad. If you believe, along with Milton and Locke, the opposite, pluralism is the only possible way for long-term civil peace. It's there in John Milton's Areopagitica, his extraordinary kind of tract of 1644 directed against laws designed to license publishing, but which also, those of you who haven't read it lately, encompassed an impassioned plea for the freedom of private conscience as well as public utterance. Goes right through the argument from Concordia to John Locke's letters on toleration 40 years later. And together, Milton and Locke and others, I'm going to come on to, make another critical jump in insisting, and this is new of the non-passive idea of toleration, that only faith accessed through rational persuasion, right reason, as Milton would say, was a faith that was true or truly worth having. Conversely, a doctrine that needed to depend on coercion for allegiance revealed not just its defensive weakness, but its essential falsehood. Besides, those two argued, both devout Christians in their way, both Milton and Locke, imposed conformity was itself a perversion of Jesus' own teaching revealed by the Gospels, a heresy that disgraced the Saviour's gift to seekers after truth through right reason. The grappling, wonderful word, Milton, who was, as you know, a great grappler, between falsehood and truth, as he said, in a free and open encounter, was the necessary exercise in which truth would necessarily prevail. All the life and power of true religion, writes Locke in the letters, consists in inward and full persuasion of mind. All that could be expected from intolerance they both believed, and as Voltaire was to say magnificently, all you can expect from coerced religion is the begetting of hypocrites and rebels. This being so, the state can never have any business arbitrating religion, much less punishing perceived infractions. To make the church in any sense a government or a branch of government was to betray the spirit and letter of the Christian Gospels, to contaminate Christian teaching with the impure business of politics in utter violation of Jesus' own separation. Likewise, Milton, Locke, and their successors, all the way through to Jefferson's wonderful proposal for religious toleration in Virginia, ultimately instituted by Madison and became the basis for the First Amendment to the Constitution. Likewise, all that they argue was sin needed to be forever dissociated from crime. Morality needed to be dissociated forever from theology. That irreversible commitment to decriminalizing acts of conscience was an extraordinary breakthrough in European history, in my view. Did that presuppose unlimited toleration now, including the toleration of the intolerant? No. Neither Milton or Locke, the Republican and the Whig, would extend toleration to Catholics, whose primary allegiance, they argued, was to a foreign authority, the Pope, and one committed to overthrowing liberty, including liberty of conscience. And huge question, which I don't have time, you'll all be back tomorrow, is the issue which remains very vexed. Of course, this is the issue in Amsterdam now. What does one do about tolerating the intolerant? The view of Milton and Locke, particularly Locke, was that tolerationists had no duty to commit suicide by offering the opportunity. What would Anne have thought? One wonders, actually, about the same issue. It's only very brave, some rather truculent philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, who in a wonderful essay in a volume edited by Susan Mendes 10 years ago or so, actually argued that toleration could actually not be a virtue, but a vice, actually, if it tolerated the intolerant. But that issue is, of course, passionately up for debate. Whether Jews could, however, despite Catholics, could be brought within the commonwealth of toleration, not just on passive sufferance in the Dutch way, but as of right, now depended on standing earlier arguments, the argument from separation, which meant not dangerous, on their head. The latitude allowed Jews in a place like Amsterdam had been conditional on their constituting this unthreatening separate zone inside the larger Christian society, unlikely to therefore to convert. But those who argued for the full naturalization of Jewish life at the end of the 17th, early 18th century, including admission to the same legal and civil rights enjoyed by Christians, now had to make something like the opposite case, that Jews would never be some sort of fifth column like Catholics, slavishly devoted to the Pope. And there was one place, as it happens, I think I will take mercy on you, uncharacteristically. I've written a bit about it in the chapter on religion in the American Future. There was actually one place, amazingly, where this breakthrough happened pretty much in Milton's generation. That was in Providence Plantation, now known as Rhode Island, and where the extraordinary Protestant preacher Roger Williams, who was on the run from what he perceived to be an unsavory and un-Jesus-like Protestant theocratic dictatorship in Boston, run by the likes of Governor Winthrop, and took up in Providence Plantation entirely to establish a community which would genuinely be available for any and every kind of confessional teaching. Jews, as they like to put it in the 17th century, Turks, meaning all kinds of Muslims as well. And lo and behold, one of the very first places where Jews settled and accepted and could buy a cemetery, which is still there, it was Newport, now in Rhode Island. Amazing thing, actually, is that, Roger Williams was no fool. He was looking hard at what was going on in England, and he went to England in the year of Milton's Areopagitica. Milton, no friend of the Jews, by the way, to talk to Sir Henry Vane at exactly the moment when the Presbyterians... Do I detect certain glazing over of the class at this point? Okay, sod the Presbyterians. Actually, I apologize to anybody in this. At a moment when this was possible. So Rhode Island did become such a place. And the Rhode Island, known as Rogue Island in the period of the American Revolution, was the place, really, which acted as a model for a tolerationist sense in early America at the time of the writing of the Constitution that would indeed allow full toleration without the necessity of actually disposing of your communal institutions. You could have the burial ground, the synagogue, you could worship in public, you could print, you could publish, you could do all those things, and there would be no bars on your admission to guilds, you were entitled to join the militia, everything was, and the famous exchange between the Truro Synagogue and George Washington in 1790 is wonderfully eloquent about that. In Europe, it's still trickier, especially for the Jews. Cromwell had allowed de facto readmission, but to Manasseh ben Israel's dismay, balked at any kind of formal recognition. Anti-Jewish sentiment, the assumption that somehow they might embark on covert Judaizing like secret Jesuits, or that their social presence alone might constitute some sort of danger, that their allegiance, Jewish allegiance, their clannish, you can get this in a lot of sort of anti-tolerationist writing of the 17th, 18th century, persisted. And as I say, Milton had his own suspicions about this. Another champion of Republican liberty, James Harrington, the author of the utopian tract Oceana, believed England could, as it were, kill two problematic birds with one stone by colonizing obstinately Catholic Ireland with Jewish settlers. Hello, Leopold Bloom, who might bring to the country, he wrote, the same economic skills from which the Dutch were profited. And there was all sorts of stereotypes on Harrington's place, and keeping them nose-holdingly clear of Albion proper itself. This line of reasoning only changed with an astonishing tract published in 1714 by the radical deist John Toland, who took up the challenge of arguing that not only would full naturalization of the Jews not only not pose a danger to the stability of Britain, crucial year 1714, Hanoverian succession secured, but that because of what Toland called the Mosaic Republic, which he deemed to have originally set out in Israelite antiquity and had been somehow mysteriously obfuscated by rabbinical oligarchy later. Because of this sort of propensity of Jews to a kind of republican democracy, I think poor old Toland was confusing sort of Jews' passion for disagreeing with each other with a form of primitive democracy. Someone should have told him the joke about the Jew who's picked up from a desert island, and the captain says, well, it's wonderful that we could actually rescue you, but tell me why there are two synagogues and one, and he says, one I pray and the other one I wouldn't be seen dead in, that sort of, it wasn't really early democracy still. More surprisingly, too, at this early stage in the Enlightenment, Toland made the case against those who argued that Jews were unhealthily preoccupied with money changing, with banking, and those kinds of activities. Toland responded to that stereotype with early sociology. Amazing, actually, before the Scottish sociologists, a generation before Montesquieu. The fancy that the Jews had more than their usual share, that he said would be found in any society, of sordid wretches, sharpers, and extortioners, he's enjoying himself a bit too much here, was no less risible, says Toland, than anti-Semitic folklore that insisted Jews could be detected by their odor, that one of their eyes was weaker than the other, and, I love this, I never heard of this prejudice before, a real stigma, they were incapable of spitting more than a few paltry inches. That wonderful image of, Rabbi Gershom and Rabbi Azai saying, I can spit. The truth, wrote Toland, was since their dispersion, they have no common or peculiar inclination distinguishing them from others, but visibly partake of the nature of the nations which they live and where they were bred, since the Jews are both in their origins and progress not otherwise to be regarded than under the common circumstances of nature, a completely sociological explanation of why there is a disproportion of Jews in whichever occupation seem to be reprehensible or praiseworthy. Once, Toland says, the free nature which had once made them indisputable, shepherds, soldiers, sailors, agriculturalists, was restored, so their place in common humanity would again become unproblematic. Naturalization without any sacrifice or religious practice was then normalization. In an addendum called Nazarenus, written a few years later, I think it was published in 1718, Toland even starkly anticipates a day when some sort of democratic Republican Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine might be rebuilt, quote, he says, which is not at all impossible, and which, by reason of their excellent citizenship, would be much more populous, rich, and powerful, getting too excited, than any other nation. So I would have you consider whether it might not be the interest and duty of Christians, he means Britain, to assist them in regaining their country. all of which would make it clear that John Toland, to put it mildly, was an outlier in the cause of toleration's extension to the Jews. It's too much, though, I think, to say that his pamphlet had absolutely no effect on the eventual absorption of Jews into British cultural life, because its arguments that distorted economic history had been a function of prejudice and social circumstance would again be used in the effect to try and pass a Naturalization Act in 1753. But neither Toland's work nor that bill famously stuck. The bill which was enacted, usually it's said as an act of gratitude of the Whig government to Jewish bankers who'd helped finance the army at the time of the Jacobite rebellion, was pounced on, I'm sure you know this, by Tory opposition to make a hue and cry that there is going to be forced circumcision, from London to Truro, that the Whig government itself withdrew the act. But when complete naturalization did come in the 19th century, of course, it did come without the kind of strings attached that had been the case in, say, revolutionary France, where admission to full legal status as citizens was made at least implicitly conditional on the understanding that Jews would now abandon the barbaric, as Voltaire called it, practices that had hitherto made them inadmissible as true Frenchmen and women. This was really Voltaire's double-edged sword, who on the one hand embraced a universalist fraternity. Voltaire says, "What, the Turk, my brother? The Chinaman, the Jews? Yes, without doubt, we are children. Are we not children of the same father?" But Voltaire, who despite acknowledging, thank you, Jean-Marie Arouet, that some Jews, he wrote this, of course, to Isaac de Pinto, could indeed be learned and intelligent, liberated from the bizarre superstitions and brutal fables of the Old Testament. This was not, Voltaire continued to think, true of the majority, and it didn't take much, really, as Arthur Hertzberg and many others have pointed out, when pressed, for Voltaire to fall back on the prejudice that, however nice, the notion that a majority of Jews would correspond to a kind of philosophic ideal of citizenship would ever be the case. Voltaire's lingering suspicions about, if Voltaire could have suspicions about the unchangeability of Jews, probably should have tipped off premature celebrants of the tolerationist Enlightenment. The declarations of victory were premature. It was barely 80 years between Voltaire's treatise on toleration with its deeply moving prayer to God, Prière à Dieu. Read it, it's really very moving, a wonderful statement of Enlightenment idealism. And the publication in 1847 of the founding text of modern antisemitism, Alphonse de Toussenel's Les Juifs rois de l'époque. Voltaire, Rabot Saint-Étienne, who died after imprisonment by the Terror, and Toland had all rested their hopes on what turned out to be a mistaken teleology of modernity, that all issues of toleration could be subsumed, as Rabot had said, into issues of liberty. It went without saying, the philosophe thought, so they actually did stop saying it, that the conquests of reason would, in the end, put a stop to credulous belief in the irrational, in miracles rather than history, in fables like the Immaculate Conception, and in miserable, wretched pieces of prejudice like the notorious smell of the Jews, and be replaced by a much more ethically grounded sense of the common humanity of mankind. So we asked just in the last minute, what went wrong? Well, what went wrong? Why are we still? First, and this is seriatim, a necessary summary inventory of what went wrong, on which I need to think and study more. First of course, self-evidently, nationalism. The romantic cult of the immemorial tribe, made from ancient bonds of language, blood, earth, custom, all things unavailable to reason, and more authentically, so romantic nationalists like Herder, for example, thought better access through a mystical communion of the generation. Outliers like the Jews could indeed be accommodated within such tribal memory, but never completely because, of course, they had their own, one inherently incompatible with a biologically grounded version of memory, or we might say a topographically, earthily, soil-like version of the physical quality of memory. Their memory is books and heads, of course. Its portability made it suspicious to the romantic obsession with roots. I remember actually someone saying to Isaac Deutscher, the Marxist writer biography, at my college at Christ's, Mr. Deutscher, what are your roots? And he said, trees have roots, young man, Jews have legs. So I've been rehearsing that forever. And then he said, so what are you working on? I said, landscape and memory. You didn't like that at all. Secondly, and this I think would have surprised both Locke and certainly Adam Smith, the response to industrialization and economic modernization was not the extension of a universal community of the irrational, but even a kind of brotherhood of the utilitarian, as you'd expect, of Grandianism, but something like the very opposite, a Gothic appeal to the spiritual in, of course, writers like Carlyle, for example, and the transcendental, through which and only through which mankind would be rescued from what Carlyle obsessively called the machine age, the tyranny of materialism. It's true that in theory the revival of religiosity might have welcomed a tolerant congregation of all faiths and none, but that, of course, is not exactly the way it worked out in practice. It's no accident that Carlyle is so, who, as you know, I've written about admiringly, is so ferocious and anti-Semite. So when nationality and worship are married together, I love the fact, actually, how many of you stayed? Some of you got to be rich enough at the Carlyle Hotel in New York. Carlyle Hotel in New York. I so wish Carlyle was alive to hear this, really. It was founded by someone called Moses Ginsberg, actually, who was Carlyle's, he was a huge fan of Carlyle. It would not have been mutual. When nationality and worship were married together, obviously as a witch's brew of exalted unreason. Third, the inability of Marxism to make a modernity in which religious profession would be seen as self-evidently and absurdly redundant and anachronistic. No Marxist state, of course, has ever had much interest in toleration, so much as the punitive control of free conscience. And not least, of course, in the wake of the God That Failed, the absolutely, I think, unpredicted, at least by my generation, at least in its force, blowback from European and American imperialism, in which the offerings of ostensibly rational modes of inquiry, of a kind of analytic materialist Renaissancem, have been themselves rejected or stigmatized as a prolongation of colonial oppression. It's on that rejection, on the equation of Western norms of modernity with shallowness, has come the particularly nightmarish, tendentious assumption that toleration is in itself a kind of form of satanic blasphemy. Now, for a long time, it seems to me, we in the West have been too surprised by the force of this repudiation of toleration to mount much of coherent intellectual defense, lest it be seen, indeed, as some form of sustained cultural imperialism in disguise, whether in our own cities at home or abroad. Or our forms of resistance have altogether taken military forms rather than actually coherent, passionate, intellectual argument. We should be flying the flag of Jefferson's statute of religious toleration of Virginia, it seems to me, rather than actually bombing our way to Kandahar, or out of Kandahar, wherever we are right now. We've taken to heart, though, very much the critique, in our critiques of what went wrong in Iraq and might still be going wrong in Afghanistan, Locke and Milton's warning that liberation of conscience can never be imposed. But we have, in a rather kind of pussy-footed way, precisely because it's been so militarily aggressive, shrunk from their anxieties about what we do when we seem to be extending toleration to the aggressively intolerant. This is a huge and dangerous subject on which I'm dangerously going to give another lecture, probably my last, actually, the week before 9/11. You're all invited as long as you've got life insurance. What, I wonder, would Anne have made of this conundrum? Might she have bent over backwards to countenance the notion that, left to themselves, the intolerant could be talked back to a generous and neighbourly view of humanity? Perhaps the younger Anne might have felt that way, the Anne who did believe despite everything, etc. But not, I think, the Anne of dark wisdom of the spring and summer of 44, with that harder knowledge of the way humans habitually act. That Anne, I rather think, would have wanted to take the fight for toleration, sort of impassioned intellectual fight, right to the intolerant. And that sense of where she would be prompts me to thank you tonight for your own kind tolerance of my intolerable number of words. Thank you.
think it's a great tribute to you that you were able to hold the audience's attention for just over an hour, which I haven't seen happen on many occasions, and to end with this enormously genuine and affectionate applause. Thank you very much for that absolutely brilliant lecture. You began by analyzing the diary of Anne Frank, moved on to the historical development of the Dutch Republic, moved on from there to the historical conditions under which toleration develops, took us through the experiences of the Nazi Germany and told us how and where things went wrong. I think to be able to do all that with enormous learning and erudition, without losing a sense of humor, and interlaced from time to time with a subdued sense of anger and indignation. I mean, that was absolutely marvelous, and I'm sure you would like to join me in thanking Professor Simon Schama. You have... You have given this series a flying start and set a wonderful precedent. And I'm sure you would also like me to thank Gillian for persuading Simon to join us this afternoon, and for the enormous amount of effort and energy with which she has been able to organize these functions. So Gillian, many thanks to you for what you've done. And I don't know if many of you have noticed, I'm sure you have, in Professor Schama's lecture, while the idea of toleration was frequently used, there were from time to time you were suggesting how the concept is problematic and why one might not think in terms of the older notions of concordia or neighborly living. And I think as I have thought about tolerance from time to time, and as I was listening to you, it's a very strange concept if you come to think of it. At one level, it appears like a virtue, which it is. At another level, it rests on assumptions which are deeply problematic and in some cases even offensive. It implies, minimally, four things. You are different from me. I'm going to judge your differences in terms of certain standards. I have the power, after I have judged you unacceptable, I have the power to eliminate you. But I am so good that I will exercise self-restraint and will leave you alone. Now if one were to examine these four presuppositions of the concept of tolerance, the availability of difference, or what you call pluralism, the possibility of judging others in terms of one's own standards, having the power, and where this power is acquired from, to deal with others and to decide the limits of acceptability and then to eliminate, and then to have the virtue of self-restraint. And I think if one looks at this, it's very striking, isn't it, that in all the great traditions, tolerance has never been seen as a cardinal virtue. It's not a cardinal virtue in the Greek tradition. It's not a cardinal virtue in the Roman tradition. Even with Christians, it's not a cardinal virtue. And if I were to step outside the European ways of thinking, if I were to look at my own tradition, whether Hindu or Buddhist, tolerance there are in fact sometimes either no words for tolerance, or if you were to translate it in local languages, you will think of things like let's live as neighbors, peaceful coexistence, commodious living, what you call active neighborliness, rather than passive tolerance. And I think it's very striking that tolerance becomes an important concept, an important virtue with the rise of modernity, which both requires tolerance and at the same time create conditions of intolerance. And I think in your own extremely subtle way, this I took with the subtext, how the same modernity which gave rise to tolerance in the form of Voltaire and many others, at the same time presupposed a certain universal notion in terms of which others were to be molded. So while you were extending certain rights to others, you were also expecting them to conform to certain models. And this, as you were rightly pointing out, leads not just to the Holocaust, but to lots of other things that we have been encountering. And in Europe, I think precisely our failure, even in the light of Holocaust, our failure to accommodate Muslims and many others, and the ease with which intolerance arises remains a problem, and goes to show how modernity, with all its virtue, has its dark underside. So I think with this very important lesson that you have alerted us to, I would once again like to thank you for a scintillating lecture, and thank you all for coming.